The older I get, the more aware I am of how much I have to learn, but at the same time I'm becoming more and more aware of the fact that I have things to say, and that people, if you're willing to listen, I'm grateful for that. But I think you'll find as you get older, the things that you learned, you have things to say, and you hope that people will maybe bend an ear to take a listen. So, as Dean Culp said, I spent about 23 years in the corporate world. I went to work right after I got out of college at a Fortune 500 company called Cummins Engine Company, and perhaps the most pivotal aspect of my time there was being mentored by J. Irwin Miller, who was a former CEO of Cummins Engine and a giant disciple. He is the visionary and the benefactor of Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, and I met him as a freshman at Harvard at a junior achievement conference. His office called me the next week and said, "Would you like to work at Cummins over the summer?" So I spent 3 summers working there, 2 in international personnel. I was a government major. And I spent time trying to figure out why the executives at Cummins were having such a horrible time moving to different parts of the world. Long and short of it is they weren't being prepared culturally or politically. They were being given a relocation policy that says, make sure you have transformers for your appliances, and we'll ship your car, and we'll pay you so much for your house, and we'll put you up in a school, and we'll move your furniture, and oh, by the way, you can go to the Berlitz School in Cincinnati and learn whatever language. But they weren't telling marketing executives who were going to Saudi Arabia that their wives had to live in American compounds. They weren't talking about the political environment. They were just opening a plant in Mexico when I was there. They weren't talking to people about the culture of Latin America, that as pumped and prompt Americans, when you say dinner is at 7, they're not going to show up. And so there are many cultures where that's true, by the way. But just little things like that. And so I did a lot of, that first experience taught me a lot about how out of touch some organizations can be with the people that are part of their organization. They weren't doing things like doing emotional or psychological evaluations. There were a couple of couples who were on the verge of divorce, one case of domestic violence, and they weren't managing the human aspect of their organization. Mr. Miller took me to lunch every summer. And one summer, I think my second summer, I did an article about him for the Junior Achievement magazine. I was very involved in Junior Achievement. It's another story for another time. But I asked Mr. Miller, what advice would you give to young people coming out of school and going to work? And he said, and I quote this all the time, "Terry, when you're in school, the feedback is all about you and how you're doing and what you're doing. But when you get out into a real job and into the real world, the higher you go, the more successful you are, the more your success will be dependent upon how you empower other people to be successful. You won't be doing everything. You will be dependent upon helping people learn to use their gifts and talents in order to achieve the goals of the organization and hopefully their own goals." And I've never really forgotten that lesson. My first job at Cummins, I was a supervisor of a completely unionized workforce in a parts warehouse. I was 22 years old. The youngest person who worked for me was 36. Stress city. I probably did not have the maturity at that point. I thought I knew a lot, but I spent more time paying attention to the people. I was able to get jobs reevaluated, get different kinds of training. The people never realized that they were actually doing more work, but they felt more valued. And if I learned nothing else from that job, it was by making people feel valued. They felt connected. They felt that an investment was being made in them. And they were actually doing more work. They were getting better pay. And my relationship with those folks went from just checking off the boxes on the union contract to having a situation where they felt I was advocating for them. I want to keep that theme of the more you live, the higher you go, the more your success is tied to enabling other people's success. As I moved through the corporate world, I left to take a job here in Chicago at IBM. Some 30 years ago, I came to Chicago in December of '83, 23 years old. I knew two people in the city, one of whom introduced me to my fabulous husband, who, if you get a chance to meet him someday, you'll be a blessed person like I am. But I worked for IBM. They wanted me to be a marketing rep. And I think they're like, oh, you can sell things. Look, I don't want to sell things. I want to know what I'm selling. So I went through all this training at IBM, spent about 5 years there, and then was recruited by one of my former managers when my husband and I moved to Indianapolis to work for Ernst & Young. I repent all the time for being an IT consultant. Because when you're a consultant, everybody wants to know what your answer to the questions is. That's a really deep trap to fall into, where you're always in a context where everyone looks to you for the answers, and you start to think that you've got to come up with them. Whether they're good answers or not, you're held accountable for coming up with the answers. When I transitioned out of consulting to work for a real company in management, the first 360 review I got when I went to a leadership development was, you need to back up and let people figure some things out. I had spent 5 years being the expert and coming up with the answers to all the problems, because that's what I was paid for. You bring in a consultant, you look at a vendor, I'm the expert on this particular product. Some of my accounts were Motorola and Kraft, and I used to travel a lot with the CIO of Motorola. It's a really heady thing if you're in your 20s and you're selling and marketing to heads of corporations, and people are listening to what you have to say. And IBM and Ernst & Young have everything invested in making sure that you know your stuff. And you're successful, the bigger the charade almost that you can put on. When I look back and think about, what was I doing? What was I really saying? But I learned soon after leaving, I call it consultant detox, that I had to start paying attention and remember what Mr. Miller said, that it was no longer about me doing everything. It wasn't about me being the brightest and the best in the room, but I now had a group of people to lead, and I had a group of people that I needed to help them develop, and that my success was going to be based on how successful people thought my team was. And so my transition out of this whole consulting stuff into a real corporation, I spent a lot of years at Anthem Blue Cross and Blue Shield. That's why I'm involved with the student health insurance, in case any of you, I've been on that committee for many years because I went through all the certifications and I understand health insurance. I went through 3 mergers at Anthem. And going through mergers, it's a melding of multiple, often conflicting sets of priorities. And if you've worked for a company and you've ever been through a merger, Van, you'll appreciate this. Everyone always says, oh, our cultures are so much alike. This is going to be really simple. It never works that way. I went from working for the acting CIO to working for a new CIO who was female and probably one of the worst people I've ever worked for. And this is why. She did not want to be in a situation where she didn't have the answer. She was incapable of being in a room and just simply turning and saying, Yvonne, can you just handle that question? We were all in a budget meeting once with the CEO of Anthem Blue Cross and Blue Shield, the IT team. And instead of simply deferring to one of her direct reports to whom that information was delegated, the idea that she would possibly know every answer to every question is simply unreasonable and impractical. And what better thing to do than to show the strength of your team by being able to defer to your team to say, she's got that, Van's got that, Kiva's got that. This person was so insecure that working for her just became a matter of managing those insecurities. And lots of people began to leave the organization. Once we were at a point where my husband was preparing to take a job here in Chicago because I wanted to come to the University of Chicago Divinity School. So at the age of 39, we moved to Chicago, and I matriculated here at the Divinity School. And at the time, I was the director of IT for the payphone division of Ameritech. now. There are no longer really payphones around. But at the time, it was a really interesting place to be. And I went there because I needed to be in a place where I could go to school. I tell this story to students who say they can do balance school and work. I was truly blessed because I had a VP who thought what I was doing was cool. There are a lot of people who don't have the freedom to kind of manage their schedule. I had that freedom to make my schedule. My boss arranged staff meetings around my class schedule for like 4 years. People don't do that. I mean, that's not a blueprint that I could offer to anybody. I was able to hire all my direct reports, and I was still coming to school here. And I did the program in 4 years, the first year part-time, 2 years full-time, including the year that I did my field ed at First Christian in Maywood. My son was 10, my husband was working at a church. So I'm probably not the person to talk to about what can't be done in a certain space of time. I was at a different time in life. I was used to juggling a lot of things. And I quite honestly am not sure that the Divinity School thought I would be able to do the program as well as I did it. But it was probably one of the happiest times of my life because I was really living out a passion. I had no idea that this work would be that important to me. And I was able, during my time at Ameritech, to sort of apply some of the understanding that I had because I had a very diverse workforce. 90% of them H-1B workers, that's the technical worker visa. 90% of those from India, but all of them from different parts of India. I had Orthodox Christian, Muslim, Hindu. I had Taiwanese. I had Buddhist employees. It was as though God was saying, you want to learn about religion? Here you go. And working in that environment and being a student gave me a real sensitivity to the fact that there was so much more to people than just the skills that they bring to the task. I'd always felt that way, but in this environment, leading this team required me to pay attention to their religious identity in a way that I had never been faced with in my previous corporate experience. So I celebrated several marriages of several of my Hindu employees who were going back to India to go through the temple ritual and get married. I had a couple of Orthodox Christians who knew that my husband was at Salem Baptist Church, and one of them, I'll never forget this, he came up over to my desk and he said, "Is your husband at Salem Baptist Church?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Man, he can really preach the word." So to have this very evangelical, kind of Pentecostal mode coming from, a young Indian man was hilarious to me because there was such a diverse set of cultures represented from that subcontinent right in my own backyard. So I really grew by just paying attention to religion as a dimension of diversity. Many of them had problems working for a woman, let alone a black woman. I hired a white male and I called him my diversity hire. It was just a weird kind of environment. When I left the Divinity School, I was hired as the director of IT strategy for the medical center. And it was at that point that after I did my first capital budget after my ordination, I knew that I didn't want to do this anymore. And I said to myself, wow, you've had great success doing this. I could care less about the capital budget for the hospital. I was essentially the chief HR and finance and strategy, not finance, but chief strategy person for the IT division of the medical center. So all of the phone lines that run in and out of the medical center, the inventory, the budget for all of those things, the system that if you go to the University of Chicago, not to student health, but if you go into any of the primary care clinics, the software that they're now using to record your patient history, I was there and those contracts were signed and worked with those vendors. I eventually decided to work with a leadership coach at the hospital to figure out how I could leverage this background. A degree in government, an MDiv, and an IT background. What else was I going to do? So I learned specifically how to talk about my experience. And this is what I do with students now. You have to learn how to talk about your experience and try to translate the value of that experience to whatever organization you're talking about looking at, be it a church, be it a nonprofit, be it if you're a PhD student be it at an institution where you might teach. Any job process is a constant interpretation of your value to that organization. If you can't do that translation, you're not going to be successful getting any kind of job. So at the hospital, I wound up applying for a job as the special assistant to the CEO. He was a very devout Catholic, and it was just, it was a complete lark that I got this job, a complete lark. Wound up working with Michelle Obama. She was the VP of Community Relations at the time. I was in a weekly meeting with her. Let me just say, she is as real as they come. She is who she presents herself to be. That's just, that's who she is. And after a year and a half into that job, got a phone call from the former dean of the divinity school saying that the dean of students was leaving. And would I be interested in being considered for the job? It meant a huge cut in pay, like 35% or something like that. So after, my grandmother died during this period. And I remember I kept hearing her say, when I told her I'd accepted a call to ministry, I never saw you in business anyway. And when she passed, that's what I kept hearing in my head. And I finally decided that if I were ever going to have the opportunity to move in a direction that got me closer to ministry, I was going to do this. So that's how I got to the divinity school. The other half of this notion of leadership is the sort of the church half of my life. I joke and say I'm bivocational with air quotes. But I've always had a life in the church. I'm the granddaughter of a minister who was a very, my papa was an erudite social activist. I still love playing the parts of my wedding because he introduced the scripture by saying something like, "And now may we allow the Lord to speak to us through his word." It was just the way he carried his phrases. And my dad's a poet. And so I grew up hearing people use their voices and use their expression in very powerful kinds of ways. I was your classic youth, involved in all the youth stuff and, conferences and, in the Baptist. I grew up in the Baptist church. And my mother and dad divorced when I was a freshman in college, and we moved to Indianapolis. And that's where I joined one of the second Christian church. So I've been a disciple since I was about 19 and quickly became involved in young adult ministry and youth ministry there. When I came out of college the first year, I worked at part-time at Light of the World on the side with the youth choir, started a drama ministry, always been a very active lay leader, and always thought that the church somehow lacked something in terms of leadership because it wasn't always lining up with these principles that I thought good organizations and good leadership managed, right? No process orientation, no strict roles and responsibilities. There was, why is that person being allowed to operate in that function? You need to get somebody who's really equipped. And I would tell my husband this all the time. Why are you letting so-and-so do that role? This is holding your whole organization back. Like, why are you doing this? I used to be very, very hard on leadership decisions that were made in the church, thinking that this, forgetting really what Mr. Miller had said, that the more you accomplish, the more you're going to rely on people to do their best and help forward the goals. When I became a pastor about 5 years ago as an interim pastor, I have learned so much in the last 5 years that have helped me sort of meld together this corporate experience along with, my adaptation to the academic world, which is also an adjustment, and the church.